So today we're going to be talking about databases. And so what you're going to need to do in order to write C# in order to connect to a Microsoft Access database is what we'll be using specifically. However, we're going to be going over concepts that you can connect to any database. But again, in this class we'll be using just Microsoft Access because it's just much easier to be able to copy and paste the entire database and be able to email it, and just a lot easier to work with in that sense. So let's talk about now the actual technology that C# uses in order to communicate with databases. So anytime you hear about ADO.NET or ActiveX Data Objects, this is the whole technology within the .NET framework that you use in order to connect to databases. And so this is really just a whole set of namespaces and a set of classes within those namespaces to connect to data sources. So again, anytime you hear ADO.NET, just think of databases. And so within ADO.NET, there's a few namespaces that we need to become familiar with. And the first one is system.data. So this is the root namespace for our database. Now there's two other namespaces within this namespace that we're going to talk about. One is the system.data.oledb, which is object linking and embedding databases. And so OLEDB is a way, it's just a generic sort of communication where you can connect to any type of data source that implements OLEDB standards. So you can use the OLEDB classes within this namespace to connect to Oracle or SQL Server or Microsoft Access. However, Microsoft has also given us this namespace called system.data.sql client. And so within this namespace, these are going to have classes specific to SQL Server. So with the .NET framework, Microsoft has given us the system.data OLEDB and system.data SQL client. I believe they also give us some Oracle namespaces and classes also. Now with that said, if you're going to connect to a Microsoft Access database, you have to use the classes within system.data.oledb. You can connect to SQL Server or Oracle or Access using OLEDB. However, if you know the specific database you're going to be connecting to, you'll want to use the classes that are written specifically for those databases. You'll just get better connections, you'll get faster connections, faster SQL statements, executions. You'll get more functionality within these classes than you will the generic OLEDB. So if you know you're connecting to a SQL Server database, you'll want to use the classes within the SQL client namespace. Now Microsoft does give us some Oracle namespaces and classes to use to connect to an Oracle database. However, if you're going to be connecting to an Oracle database, when you install the Oracle client on your machine, it will actually give you, with that install, an Oracle.client, I believe, classes. And so you would use those classes that Oracle has written to connect to the Oracle database. So it just makes sense to use the classes written by Oracle because they're going to understand, the architecture of an Oracle database versus better than Microsoft writing these classes to connect to an Oracle database. So again, you would just use the DLLs that Oracle has given you to connect to their client. Where if you're connecting to SQL Server, you would use the DLLs and code within the SQL client namespace. And we'll take a look at some of these in just a second. So again, system.data.oledb contains classes that are designed to work with any namespace, where the SQL client now will be optimized to work with SQL Server database. Excuse me. So now within the system.data namespace, we're going to have to work with something called a data set in order to be able to pull data out of our database and be able to manipulate it in memory in our application. So to do that, we have this object called a data set. And a data set, you can think of it as just like an in-memory database. And if you just think of it that way, it's really easy to use. And so within the data set, which is like a database, there is classes called data tables. And so these data table classes are just like they sound. They just mimic a database table. So they're going to have rows and columns. So within your data set, you can have as many data tables as you need, just like in a database. Now within a data table, they use two other classes, which are data columns and data rows. So you have a data set made up of as many data tables as you need, which a data table is then made up of data columns and data rows. So obviously a data column defines each column within your data table. So this actually also says this is of string type, int type, etc., etc. And then you would instantiate a data row. So after you've built up this data set and data tables and you define the data columns, you can then instantiate a data row based off of this definition of this data table that you've created. So that when you instantiate the data row, it would have all the proper columns within it set up. And we'll take a look at that a little bit more later on. Now, an important thing to remember about data sets is they're what's called disconnected. So what that means is that what you do is you open a connection to your database, you pass it a query, you then return data to you and you fill up a data set, and then that connection is actually severed. So it's what's called disconnected. So this data set is not related anymore to your database. And I just mean it's disconnected. So you open up a connection, you pull data into your data set, and then you close the connection. You can then manipulate that data all you want inside your in-memory local data set, and it will not affect your database because you're disconnected. Now from there are ways to say, hey, things that I've updated in my data set, go populate back into my database, but in order to do that, you have to reestablish connections, and then you have to pass that data back into your database. So just understand that data sets are disconnected. They're just in-memory databases. So now, how do we actually make these connections to the databases? Well, the first class we need to use is this OLEDB connection. So this represents the actual connection to our data source. So this will also hold our connection string to our Microsoft Access database. So to hold a connection to Microsoft Access database, we just point to the file where our Microsoft Access database is located. Oracle actually has a different type of connection scheme, so you actually set that up a little bit different, but you still use connection objects. The next class we need is OLEDB data adapter. So the data adapter will use the connection object in order to connect to your data source and then fill up a data set in memory. So the data adapter is the class we use to connect to the database, pull the data out, and fill up a data set. So you need both of these classes in order to do that. Then the last class we're going to be talking about is OLEDB command. So you need all three of these classes in order to actually pull data back. So you'll need the connection object, which represents the actual connection to the database. And then the data adapter is going to use your connection and your command object to connect to the database, pass it this SQL statement, and then return that data back into an SQL statement. Now, you'll notice that each of these that we're going to be learning about is OLEDB connection or OLEDB data adapter or OLEDB command. So all of these classes we're going to be learning about today are in this system.data.oledb namespace. And the reason we're learning about these specifically is because in this class we're going to use Microsoft Access Database. Now, first thing, there are lots of other classes that you can use in the system.data namespace. There are all kinds of database classes, but these are the main classes that will help you get you 99% of the way there for the job that you need to get done. So that's why we're going to cover them in detail. Now, all these other classes are going to allow you to do transactions in your database, execute stored procedures, maintaining connections. There's just a ton of other database methods. There's even a whole bunch of visual controls that we're not going to go over. That are going to help you adapt the data and fill it up and display it a particular way in a particular types of control. Again, I've just chosen to go over sort of the main classes that you'll be using to get data out of the database, fill it up, and then display it. And then once you kind of understand that, it's not really hard to then take a look and see what other classes are available and start understanding those, because these are sort of complicated enough. So the other thing is that just remember that since we're using all these OLEDB connection and data adapter and dataset classes, if again you go into the real world and they say, oh, we're using a SQL Server database, you would use these equivalent classes that are in the SQL client namespace. So you would just use the connection class that's inside the SQL client namespace and vice versa. And that's really the only thing you'd have to change in order to change the database between Oracle or SQL client or MS Access. So just these basic classes right here. So again, once you understand how you can use these, it's really easy to fix this one class we're going to write to be able to connect to any type of data source. So this is kind of the high level view of the classes that we're going to be using today. And again, it's just with your accessing databases, you just have to jump in there, start writing code, and it'll help you to get your head wrapped around it, because there's just so many different classes and it's kind of a complicated technology. So again, it's just practice, practice, practice. That's all I can say. And so I've actually got lots of different database examples we're going to walk through. And we're actually going to write a class together, this data access class, and you'll be able to use that on your assignments. And the more time you spend on this, the more it'll sink in. So now let's go ahead, and I'm going to bring up a blank Windows Forms document. And what we're going to do here is I want to just do a very basic connection to Microsoft Access database, and I just want to display some data from that database. So what I've done is I found this window called Data Sources, and you can up into the View, Other Windows, Data Sources. So the Data Sources window allows you to connect and pull in data from various data sources. So it doesn't have to just be a database. You can get a web service from the database. You can actually just query an object, or you can connect to SharePoint. So you can actually connect to files. There's different ways that you can connect to data sources and pull in data. For this class, we're going to connect to a database. So go ahead and click Next. What type of database model do you want to use? Well, data set. That's what we've been learning about, right? So this is pretty straightforward. We're going to pull data from our database into an in-memory structure called a data set. Go ahead and click Next. Now it's saying, okay, what data connection do you want to use? Well, there's no data connections currently defined in our application, so we have to click New Connection. So this is behind the scenes generating that OLEDB connection object that we were talking about before. So when I click New, it says, okay, well, what type of data source are you connecting to? Okay, well, we look here. Oh, look, Microsoft Access file. Here's our data provider. Go ahead and click Continue. Now it says, okay, well, where is this database located? So I'm just going to go ahead and just bring up one of the examples that we can use. So we'll say my program examples. Let's come in here. So let's connect to this books.mdb database. Now there's no username or password, so we don't have to worry about that. We can click Test Connection. We can see it succeeds. Go ahead and click OK. Now if we open this up, down here, I want you to just kind of remember this syntax right here, because this is what helps you build up that connection string that we're going to use inside that connection object. And so this will look very familiar in just 1 second. And so remember that syntax right there. And this is just saying, hey, do you want to copy this file, this Microsoft Access database over, into this particular project? That's fine. Here, what do you want to just name your connection? That's fine. Now it's saying, okay, well, what data do you want to pull into your database? So you'll notice it figured out it connected to Microsoft Access, and it said, here's all the tables. Let's just go ahead and select them all. And here's the name of our data set. It's going to save it as Books Data Set. Go ahead and click Finish. And so what this did is it wrote a tremendous amount of code for us, all that plumbing, that ADO.NET plumbing, to connect to a data source and be able to pull data back and display it. So let's go ahead and display it now. So what we can do is, now that it's written all this plumbing for us, we can come in here and we can say, okay, I've got all these data sources over here. What do I want to display out of my books data set? So let's come over here to authors, and let's just drag that onto our form here. And you can see just by dragging and dropping this one database table onto my form here, it created all kinds of controls for me. So let's bring up properties. And so over here, you'll notice that it actually dropped on here something called a DataGrid View. So this DataGrid View is something we're going to be using a lot of in the next few examples and in this class. And all this does is it's kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. It just displays the rows and the columns for a database table that's stored in your data set. And then there's an equivalent called data set within WPF. So we'll also be looking at some WPF examples later on and the difference between the new controls that you use to display data there. Now, just from dragging this one table onto here, you notice first off it gave us this little control up here, this binding navigator. So again, all these those extra classes that I was talking about as far as this ADO.NET framework, this is one that they use called a binding navigator, and it binds to this data set and this display over here, this data grid view, and it just allows you to navigate through automatically, giving you that functionality through your data. And they've already written the plumbing that you can save and delete records, and not only will it delete it from the in-memory data set, it's actually going to go back to the database. So it's kind of nice. We just dragged and dropped, and now the end user could manipulate this kind of like an Excel spreadsheet and be able to just save and update and add records. So in order to do that, they had to add in a books data source, they had to add in a binding source class, a books dataset table adapter, another table adapter, a binding navigator. So they had to add in all these classes down here that they actually custom wrote for us, along with some other classes, just to get this to work. So let's go ahead and run this and take a look at what it did. And so we can see that, here we go, we can actually navigate through, and it pulled in all the data from that table, and we can save and update and delete just with simply making a connection, running through a little wizard, dragging and dropping, and it displays the data. Now, the thing that I've found is it's very rare that you'll have just this simple of functionality within an application. I've never found it to be just this simple. And so maybe you would do this just to debug or get your head wrapped around a problem, but I couldn't ever see you deploying code like this. It's just, again, the types of problems you need to solve are going to be more complex than just very simple updating and deleting data. And also with your end users, you need to do a lot of validation, and you need to be really careful they don't mess up the data in your actual database. So I think wizards are nice to give you a very quick and dirty way of just displaying the data, getting things to work, maybe prototyping out and reducing risk in your overall project. However, I would never recommend using these wizards within Visual Studio to generate data for a real project. And the other reason for that is if you come over here into some of this code that they've written for you. So in this like books data set over here, this is what it took to write that books data set. So as I scroll through here, here's all the code that it took to pull in that data, bind to the data grid view, and then be able to have that binding navigator and be able to save, update, and record. So you can see this is the kind of code it takes to do that for you. And so if I come down here, you'll notice that it actually wrote over 4,300 lines of code. So the thing that I've found is that that code is just not maintainable. And it's really hard in the future to come back in here and be able to fix it and update it. Again, especially 10 years from now. Or I found that sometimes you'll delete something or change a piece of code and it just screws everything up, and it's really hard to fix all of that code that they've written for you. So I just would not recommend using these wizards. So that's just a way that we can use this data grid view in order to display the data. Now, all they've done here is they've just instantiated a data set behind the scenes right here, and then they've just bound that to the data source property of our data grid view. And so we're going to have lots of examples where we're going to do all of this type functionality, but we're going to do it manually. So I want to close down this application now, and I'm going to bring up this application here that I've already given you in Canvas. And this Chapter 21 database class example, what we're going to do here is we're actually going to now start working with the data access layer, and we're going to create this data access layer that you've heard me talking about before. So we talked about interior development, we talked about the application, middle, and database tiers. And so this database layer, your data layer, what you want to do is this envelops, your SQL server itself, and it also contains classes that hold your SQL statements. It also contains code that, all the classes use to connect and bind to your data sources. And so what I find really useful is to create a single class that's used throughout my application that my business layer uses. They'll use this one data access class. And so as far as the data, the middle tier is concerned, it uses one class and it takes care of all the plumbing to connect to whatever data source we need. And by doing this, we're gonna hard code it today to connect to a Microsoft Access database. And let's say we deployed our program that way, and then 5, 10 years down the road, they say, you know what, we've outgrown this Microsoft Access database, we need to implement Oracle. What you can do is because your business layer has used this one class, and that one class, this data access class, is taking care of all the plumbing to connect to Microsoft Access. You update this one class to now change its connection types to Oracle versus Microsoft Access, and your business layer, your middle tier, and your top tier, they continue working just fine because they don't care about where this data comes from. It doesn't care the technologies. I mean, it doesn't care if you get the data from a file or a database or a web service. It has no idea. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create this CLS data access class. Now I've also already given this to you that you can download from Canvas, and that file's for students. There's some help in there. And so this has already been given to you, and you can use it in all of your projects. You can just drag and drop it and you're done as far as putting it into your projects. Now we're going to walk through this class, and what I recommend if you really want to learn this stuff, and again, the way I've structured this class is it's sort of like you can spend as much time as you want, trying to further your knowledge of C# or as little time as you want just to get stuff done. But if you really want to learn how ADO.NET works in the real world, I would try to write this class by yourself after you've learned these concepts. Because it's one thing to follow along, it's another to write it from scratch yourself, and you realize just how much you haven't learned or memorized to write this kind of stuff. So that's what I would personally recommend if you're able to do it. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to connect to our data source here, or write this data access class, and we're going to need a connection to our database. And so in order to do that, we need to define a few things. We need to define our connection, which we'll do here. And then in this class, we're actually going to go ahead, move this over here so it's out of our way. We're going to write 3 different methods to get the job done of being able to, connect to the database and then pull in data or update data in our database. So this class, we're going to be able to execute SQL statements. So that's us pulling in data from a database, saying with select statements. So this is, okay, I'm going to connect to the database, I'm going to execute this SQL statement, like select all from authors, and then I'm going to return that data in a data set. And oh, by the way, this is how many values or how many rows are in my data set. And it's just kind of an easy way of returning how many records were returned, rather than us having to go into this data set that was returned, and we can just quickly look at this and see if there was any records even returned to us in our data set. Another one is execute SQL, or sorry, execute scalar SQL, and this is when you want to just return a single value from the database. And so all this is like select the author ID from the authors table. So when you have a scalar value, that just means that it's a unique value. So generally you're returning some sort of database ID in this particular instance is where you can do execute scalar for. So the last method we're going to be working with is this ExecuteNonQuery. So let me move this over here for us. So ExecuteNonQuery is our updates, our inserts, and delete statements. So it's non-query statements. So this is just insert this data to the authors table kind of a thing. So this is where we'll pass in the insert statements that we'll be using. So let's come back up here to the top and let's actually write the actual connection string now. And so to do that, we're going to need a private variable called string s connection string. So we're connected to a Microsoft Access database, so it just holds the path to the file. And so you'll notice now in the constructor here, what I've done is this should look fairly familiar to you on that connection string we just looked at, that it was generated for us through the Visual Studio. And so you'll notice it just kind of has some stuff that's saying, hey, the provider is this jet OLEDDB and the data source is this right here. And so what I've done is, the way I've written this is so that all you have to do is put this books.mdb file right next to the exe of your application. So this says, hey, find the current directory that my exe is executing in and return that. And then you notice I just tack on that books.mdb. So in future applications, all you have to do is put whatever MDB file you're using next to your exe and then change this little piece of code right here. You just point to your new MDB file and you can execute this particular piece of code and it'll work just fine. So we've set up our connection string now. So now what we need to do is we need to write our execute SQL status, so we can say select, from this table and pull data back into our data set so we can do something with it. So the first thing we need is a data set. So we're going to be pulling data back, so we need to pull it back into a data set. And that's actually what the object we're going to be returning. So we're going to need a data set. So you can see we're going to return this data. We're saying, hey, execute this, pull data back into a data set, and then return this to whoever used this class in that business object layer. So now the next thing I'm going to put in here, this particular statement we have not learned about yet. And so I'm going to put this using statement in here. And I'm actually going to put another one right below, and then let's go ahead and talk about them. So what we're doing here is we're creating a connection object. So this shouldn't be too confusing. So we have our OLEDDB connection, and we're just simply instantiating it and passing this connection string to it. So this enables us to make a connection to our database. The next statement is this data adapter. So remember, the data adapter is what's used to fill up a data set here. So we've instantiated our data set, we've now created our connection, and we've also created our data adapter. So if you remember, the only thing left we have is that command object, the OLEDDB command, and we're going to do that in 1 second. But let's discuss these using statements. So the using statements, what they allow you to do is not have to write any extra code in order to properly dispose of these classes. So yes, C# has a garbage collector that manages memory for us and cleans up those resources. However, the type of things like connections to databases or connections to files or other things that we are in charge of disposing of, we would actually have to write the code to close the connection. So for instance, if I didn't use these using statements, I would have to say something like, connection, just right here, connection.close. And close, again, we've made that connection to the database, and we always want to make sure we close that connection when we're done. Or what could happen, and this is a very common bug, is that you just keep connecting to your database every time to pull data out of it, and you forget to close that connection. And so usually a database, its manager can only allow so many connections to it at a given time. So eventually it'll actually run out of connections that it can open, and it'll start just rejecting connections. And then your DBA gets really mad at you for doing this, and you'd never want to do it in a deployed system because you would crash your system. And so you always want to make sure you close your connections to your database. Well, what's nice about using the using statements is, let's say right here we had that connection.close. Okay, we wrote our code, we remember to do this. But what happened if this statement threw an exception? Well, this line of code wouldn't get executed, and what would happen? We'd leave that connection open. So what we can do is we can have a using statement, and what a using statement does is that when your code hits this block right here, it guarantees you that it's going to call what's called the dispose method on your class, which also in turn calls the close method. And so just remember, anytime you use a using statement, it's guaranteed to call the code of the dispose method, which will close whatever connection or resources you have for these particular classes. And we just learned about interfaces, and so you'll notice that this particular object, this class OLEDB connection, implements these interfaces, and one of them is called iDisposable. So whoever wrote this OLEDB connection class signed a contract with the compiler that it will implement iDisposable. So if we go to iDisposable, you'll notice that it guarantees that there is a dispose method. So since the compiler knows there's a dispose method, that's what it calls. So it actually writes the code behind the scenes for you. So it hits this bracket and it just calls connection.dispose. And so you'll notice if I say connection.dispose, sure enough, there's the dispose method that says releases all resources used by this particular object. So that's what's really nice about the using statements, is you're guaranteed to call the dispose method, which will close the connection, or with the same thing with the data adapter. It's going to make sure that it cleans up all the resources used with it. So you always want to put these kind of things in using statements, or else you'd have to do try-catch blocks, and you'd have to do a finally block and make sure that you close your connections. So now that we've instantiated these objects, we need to use them. So the first thing we need to do is actually open a connection to our database. So we've instantiated these objects, and now we're going to actually make the connection to the database. And now that we've done that, what we're going to want to do is we're going to start wanting to use our adapter. And so our adapter actually contains within it the select command. So this right here is actually, you'll notice, an OLEDB command object. So this is that command class that we learned about a few minutes ago. And so we're going to instantiate a new one of these. And we're just going to happen at the same time that we instantiate it, we're going to pass into it this SQL statement that the user passed in. And we're going to pass into it the connection that we just opened. So our data adapter uses the OLEDB class to connect to this database to execute this SQL statement. So I'll say that again. So our OLEDB adapter, this class here, is used to pull in data from our database. It uses a command object to use the connection object to connect to the database and execute this SQL statement. So we've set up all of our data, and this is just says don't time out. So if you set this to 1000, it'll be set to after a second, go ahead and time out. We want to say take as much time as we can, but again, maybe you want to set this up so if ever an SQL statement takes longer than 10 seconds, an exception gets thrown and says we've timed out. But we're going to just let ours go on forever. And so now what we need to do is actually fill up our data set. So we've opened the connection, we've set up the command object inside of our data adapter, and now what we can do is we can fill up our data set with data. So this connected to the database, and then this adapter.fill actually uses this connection object and the SQL statement to actually fill up this data set. So this is where we're actually going to the database, telling it to execute this SQL statement, and then pulls back that data over the network, and it fills up this data set with us. And then what I do here is I just look into this data set and I get the count of how many rows there are and return it to the user through this reference parameter. And then I also take a look and just return the data set. So now this syntax here, let's take a look at what actually makes up a data set. So we've got our data set DS. And you'll notice that there's all kinds of helpful methods in here, where we can accept changes to it, we can begin, initialize it, we can clear it, copy it, merge it, do lots of various things. But the main thing that we're going to be interested in is this tables collection. So this tables collection is made up of data tables. So it's just a collection, it's just an array of data tables. So when you execute these statements up here, it's all going to return the data into one data table, which just happens to be the first and only data table within our data set. So we can just access this data table. So this statement returns a single data table to us. But if we wanted to, we could manually put as many data tables in here as we wanted, then you would just change the index. But we're only interested in the first data table because that's the only data that we returned. And so now we can say dot to access all of the methods against our data table. And so again, there's lots of different things we can do to a data table here. And the easiest thing to do now is say, okay, what we want is to figure out, how many rows are inside of our data table. So this is a collection now of our rows. So if we wanted to, we can actually index any number of our rows. So let's pretend that we want the fourth row of data. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3 would give us the fourth row. So now we've got our row, our data row object, so we can say dot, and now this we can start manipulating data for our data row. We could delete the row, we can take a look here, we can see what columns it has, or we can access this item array. An item array actually allows us to access the columns within that. So we could say access the first column. So this is a way of saying go into the first data table, access the fourth row of that data table, and then access the first column in that data row. Another way that we can do this is we can actually use this other syntax, something like this, and this says, go to the fourth row and go to the second column within that row. But what we're interested in is just returning the number of rows. So we just say inside of our database, access the first table, and then access the rows collection, and then find out how many are in those rows. And so this method will execute the SQL statement and return the data in a data set. So the next one we want to look at is this execute scalar. Now this method takes in an SQL statement, something like, select, account all from employees, something like that. It will return back a single number. Or select the first name from, employee where employee ID equals 1, 2, 3. So you would return just a single value. And you can see we're going to return that in a string. And so the first thing we do is we have to use our connection and our data adapter. We open up the connection, looks exactly the same. We set our select command. And now rather than doing the statement here where we fill up a data set, inside of our data adapter we can actually say, okay, my data adapter, access the select command, and then from it do execute scalar. Execute scalar returns us an object, and then we can just say, hey, if that object is not equal null, just go ahead and return object.toString. So again, this is just kind of a helpful method. You could certainly always use the execute.sql statement, but then you have to go into the data set, go into the first table, go into the first row, go into the first column to pull out that single piece of data, where this just returns it in a string, and strings are just a little bit easier to use. So maybe you're just trying to pull out an ID, trying to pull out a social security number for a given employee. So this is just a very easy way of doing it when you need a single value. The last one we're going to work with is this ExecuteNonQuery. So this is when we're inserting records into our database, updating records, or deleting records. So we set up our connection. Now you'll notice that there's no data adapter in this particular method. And the reason for that is that we don't have any need for it. We're not filling up a data set. So you'll notice that we just create our connection to our database, we open it, and then here all we have to do is just use our command object in order to execute non-query. So there's various methods. So here inside this command object we can execute scalar, or we can even just execute non-query. But we don't need a data adapter in this example because all we're doing is executing a query. So this statement could say delete from authors where author ID equals 1, 2, 3. This actually returns the number of rows that were affected by that update insert queries. And so this is kind of nice in that then you can take a look at how many records were updated or deleted or inserted, and you can know if that statement executed correctly. So it can a way of your expectations for what this query should have done. So now that's the basics of this class. Now in the real world you would create this class and it would have a lot more than just these couple of methods in here. This is, again, these three methods I tend to find do 99% of the work I need done. However, depending on if you need the ability to execute stored procedures in your database, and then you'd have to add in some attributes, you'd have to figure out which classes you use to execute stored procedures, and then you just write another method that says execute stored procedure, you pass in the name of stored procedure, and then you would just use those new classes in the OLEDB data set, your namespace in order to do that. So there's all kinds of additional functionality you could add to this data access class, but it just depends on what you need it done, at your particular job. So with that, let's go ahead now and let's use this class. And so we've got this form here, and we're going to be able to do a few different things with it. We're going to be able to submit a query, like select all from authors. We're going to be able to execute a non-query, like update from authors. Extract a single value, which we'll look at our scalar method. We can pull data back from the database and fill up a list box, or be able to fill up a combo box. So let's come over to our code over here, and the first thing you'll notice that we need to do is instantiate our data access class. Now I've just done it this way for simplicity, but in real examples, the way you'd want to do it in your code, you'd always want to do it this way. So you always want to create your object reference at the class level, and then down here is where you would actually instantiate it. So this first one we're going to take a look at is this command submit query click. So that's this button right here. So we're saying take whatever data the user puts in here as a query and execute it. So we're going to be using a data set. So here we need an object reference, because remember it was actually instantiated inside this execute SQL statement. So this is just used to return that data into. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass into this execute SQL statement or method the SQL that the user's given to us. We've got this number of return values here that it's getting passed in. So we execute this, we fill up that data set. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bind this data set to our DataGrid's data source. So this DataGrid view right here, it has what's called a data source that you can bind to. So it's just saying, okay, here's my data grid. What data do you want me to display in it? That's what data source, this property, does. And there's different things you can bind to this or set this to. We're going to bind it to our data set. Now, because we've bound it to our data set, there could be lots of data tables within that. So what you have to do now is say, okay, the data member of my data source is actually this table. So you'll notice I'm saying I'm pulling out the table name for the first table in here. Now, what you could do, and it's a little bit more straightforward, is you could actually do something like this and just set your data source to the data table that you want to bind to. So you wouldn't have to do this second line of code anymore. But with this way, if you're binding it to the data set, you're going to have to actually use the data member also. So that's how you would submit a query. Now when we're updating it, it looks really similar, except now we're just calling ExecuteNonQuery and passing in that statement. So let's pretend, again, now this, you would never want this kind of code behind your user interface. You'd want to abstract this out into a separate, business layer type class, which then you return, data from it to the UI. So again, this is just a very simplistic example. But notice how easy it is now. All the complicated plumbing by this data access class is taken care of for us. So we sat down, and let's say it took us 3 or 4 months to write this class. And then all we do is we distribute this data access class to other developers. And as far as they're concerned, they just say, hey, execute this statement. Execute this non-query. They don't worry about all the complication of opening and closing connections and using data adapters and data sets and all these things. They just say, go give me the data, and their job is done. And you've done all the real complicated work. And so this is update statement. We come down here, here's the scalar click. And so you'll notice here's an SQL statement that's going to return a single value. So it's just going to return a first name. So we're going to execute the SQL statement, execute the scalar SQL statement to return the first name and display it. Now we're going to be working with the fill list box and the fill combo box. So we come over here and we can say, okay, we're going to execute this SQL statement, and it's going to get everything from the authors table, fill up this data set. Now what we're going to do is we're going to loop through this data set. And I done this way to show you how you can get the count out. So ds.tables.rows.count. So I'm just showing you this is how many rows are in our data set. Now what's another way we could have done that? We could have used iReturnValue. And so this is why I'm showing you how it just easier that we've already gotten this piece of data. So this will guarantee that we'll only loop through if there are rows returned. So this is we're going to loop through all the rows of our data set. And so now what we can do is we can start executing that or pulling out those pieces of data. So we say, okay, we're always pulling out, there's only one data table that we're interested in, and that's the first data table. So within that data table, access the rows, access the first row the first time through the loop. And now the way this, since we pulled in all of the data, the first column is the author ID, and so we're trying to pull out the first name and then the last name. And so that's column 2 and column 3. So here we're saying, okay, access whatever current row I'm on as I'm iterating through them, pull out the first name, which happens to be the second column, concatenate that with the last name, which is the third column. And so I'm showing you two different ways of how you can pull out data from a data set here. Now another thing you could have done is a for each statement. And so a for each statement, what you could do is you could say for each data row, dr in my data set dot rows. So this is another way, and it's kind of an easier way. This is kind of a way that I like to do it. So I'm just saying, hey, loop through all the data rows within this collection, and then I can just say data row sub, and it's basically, you know, from this point on. So within my data row, you know, access the second column within it, and then .toString. So that's another way that you could do the ability of looping through. So now here we're going to fill up a combo box. So you notice we're doing the same statement here. Select all from authors. We're filling it up, but rather than filling up this list here, this list box, we're just going to fill up a combo box, and we're going to do the exact same things with it. So now when we run this, we're now able to use our class like select all from authors. Go ahead and run that, and you can see it bound that data, it executed the statement. So let's just debug this one method here. So let's come up here to submit query. Let's click that button again. So it comes in here, and you'll notice we pull out our SQL statement, and this is set to 0. Let's do F11. So it comes in, it instantiates a new data set, instantiates our connection object, instantiates our data adapter. We connect to our database. We instantiate our command object using our SQL statement and our connection object. And remember, our connection object has been linked to our connection string. Here's where we actually fill up. We've connected to our database now. We've filled up our data set. Here we pull out how many records or how many rows we've returned. We return our data set, and now we just bind it to our DataGrid view. And then we could also do execute non-queries or scalars. We can fill up our list box or fill up our combo box with data. So let's go ahead and close this application down. So this next example here, we're going to look some more into the DataGrid view. And again, I've tried to create lots of different examples on how we can use this data access class and how we can fill up DataGrid views. And then in a later lecture, we'll be working with WPF specifically and how you fill up data grids. But you'd still be using the exact same data access class even in WPF. So in this example, this data grid example, you'll notice we're using the exact same data access class. So we just wrote this class, and then we've created this form where when we run it, it's going to go ahead and fill up this DataGrid view with data. It's going to go to our database, pull back data, bind it to this DataGrid view, and then from there what we can do now is we can select a particular row here, and then we can update the first and last name from that row, or we can enter in a new first name and last name and add it at the location that we've selected here. And then the last bit of functionality is that we can select a row and actually delete it. Now, the thing about this example that I want to point out is that everything that we're doing is in memory. So you would actually have to write the plumbing to then insert data back into the database or actually delete the database. I'm just showing you how to do it in memory in this particular example. So just be aware of that. This is not updating the database. It's just updating our data set in memory. Because remember, data sets are connection list. That is a test question, by the way. So here we go. We're going to instantiate our data access class. This bool is deleting. We'll get back to what that actually does in just a second. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look. Let me bring up my code here. So what we want to do is when this form first loads, we're going to want to pull back some data from our data set or from our database and fill up our data set. So what we're doing is this is just selecting a bunch of data for us. So we're just going to select the author ID, first name and last name from authors. So we're getting all of this data out of the authors table, but we've specified particular columns. Here I'm just showing you that you can name the data table. I almost never do this, but I'm just showing you that you have the ability to name it if you did need to. And so now that we've executed this, let's go ahead and say, okay, I've got this DataGrid View 1, and I'm going to set its data source to my dataset.tables sub 0. So I'm setting it equal to the first data table within my data source. So we can set that there. The next thing that I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, I want to automatically just select the first row of data in my DataGrid view. So it'll be highlighted when the application first runs. Here I'm just showing you that for each DataGrid column inside of our DataGrid view, you're able to set the sort mode. So how the user can actually sort the different pieces of data, either make it not sortable or automatic. Now we come down here, we're going to hide the first column. So why are we hiding the first column? Well, someone using our application doesn't even know what author ID is. They just know first name and last name. So we're just going to hide that first column from the user. We want that data to work with, but we don't want the end user to see it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to actually set up some more friendly header text names for the first or the second and third columns, because when it returns it, it's going to default to these names here. And so there's no spaces in between. So we want to make it more user friendly. So this is what's going to happen when the application first runs. Now what I've done is I've actually set the event current cell changed. So all I've done is over here in the properties, I've taken a look at my events, and there's lots of different events that you can handle from the DataGrid view. This DataGrid view, when you drag and drop it onto here, and let's open up the toolbox. So under the Data tab here, here's this DataGrid view that I just dragged and dropped onto my form. There are so many different events that you can work with in a DataGrid view. And because of that, it adds some complexity, but it also adds power and control of your program. And so I just warn you that the DataGrid views can be a little bit complicated to work with when you want to do more complicated tasks than just displaying data into them. Like for instance, I'm going to be handling the current cell changed. So anytime the user clicks on a new cell, this event's going to get fired. But there's lots of different, you can do it when rows get removed or added, like for instance if they're deleting things here. It just can be really complicated, all the different things that you can do. And by handling a lot of these different events, you could, every time they click a cell or they leave a cell, you could validate the data within it. You can make this act just like an Excel spreadsheet and validate, the data and update the data in the database right as they're typing, if you handle the correct events. But for this first one, I'm just handling current cell changed. So anytime they click into a new cell, this particular event is going to get fired. And so I'm just, as they're clicking different rows, I want this to fill up with a current selected first name and last name. So you come in here, and you always want to make sure that the current row is not null. So I go into my DataGrid view, and I say, is the current row not null? Because you can actually select a little blank column down here at the bottom, or blank row. And so you always want to make sure the current row is not null. We're going to come back to this is deleting in just 1 second. And so we say, okay, the user has selected a row. And so now that they've selected a row, we want to start pulling out, which row was selected. So there's two different ways we can do that. So the first way we can do that is by saying, okay, go to my DataGrid view, access the current cell that we're in and its row index. So that'll give us which, the index of the row that was selected. And another way we can do the exact same thing is just to say DataGrid view current row dot index. So just two ways that we can figure out what the index of the selected row is. Then what we can do is just make sure we're just doing some validation here, and then we're just pulling out from our data set that row of data. and we're displaying it in our text boxes here. So we knew which row the user highlighted. We just go to that row in our data set and pull out the first name and last name. So the next thing we're doing is this command update click right here. So we've pulled in the data, so we've pulled out the first name and last name, and now they can change these and click update. In memory, it's going to change it in our data set. So we get that data that the user entered, and then we say, okay, access our data set, pull out which row the user is currently selected on, and then we're going to set the first name and last name to these values that the user has entered. So this is a way of overriding the first name and last name on the selected row, and it will update the data set. And this is just accepting the changes. So we're sort of committing the changes to the data set is all this is doing. Now again, we're not updating the database, just our in-memory data set. If you wanted this to update the database, you would then have to say, okay, updated this particular row, so I'd have to then create an SQL statement that says, update authors where, set the first name and last name to this, where the author ID equals, and you could pull out that particular piece of data. Here's where we're adding a new row into our code. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, the user can select a row here, add in a new first name and last name, and click add. So we come over to here and we say, okay, the first thing we're going to need to do is pull in the data, and then we're going to generate a new data row. But you want a data row with the correct data columns in it from our data set. So we say data tables sub0 dot new row. And so this will generate a row with us with the proper columns that we've defined before, the author ID, first name, and last name. So now that we've got our data row, we can fill it up with data. Now here I'm just putting in a garbage value, but this is something you'd want to go to your database, where you'd either use a sequence from your database and you would extract the next sequence number from your database, or you would go to a particular table and add one to the current, whatever the ID is. But again, I'm just generating a garbage number here for our author ID. I'm filling up this data table with the first and last name. And now inside my data table, I can say insert at a particular row, add this row at this index is what I'm doing. And then I'm just accepting the changes in the data here. So now the user needs the ability to be able to delete records. So again, we're just making sure the user has deleted it. We pull out whatever index the current user has selected. Now here's the thing that you need to be a little bit careful of, is we need to actually figure out that the user is deleting a row. And I'm going to walk through this about why I've put this deleting code in here. But to delete the record, we just say, okay, here's my data set, delete this row. So inside my data set, access the first data table, access the row that was selected, that we returned here, and delete that row from my data set. We're accepting the changes, and we're set deleting to false. Now I'm going to walk through this code and show you what actually happens. And so this is where some complexity of that DataGrid view can come in, because by deleting a row, other events that you're handling can automatically get fired. So think about this. Let's say I have, let's go ahead and run this, and let's say I have selected this row right here, okay? And I've selected it for deletion. When I click delete right here, what happens? Well, my selected cell changes because this is going to get deleted and suddenly this one is going to get selected. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that this method up here, let's go ahead and just shrink some of this down so we can get to it. This method right here, this current cell changed, is going to automatically get fired and ran when I execute this statement right here. And this is a perfect example where it's really easy to put a bug in your code. And you kind of just have to either realize this ahead of time because you know which events you're handling, or you figure it out the hard way about why it's not working the way you want. And so what I've done is, let's hit this debug point here, and I say is deleting equals true. As soon as I execute this statement, what's actually going to happen is this method or this event is going to get fired, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say if deleting equals false, then do this code. But if it's true, like it's going to be, just skip over this. and don't do anything in here. And so that's why then eventually I set it to false. So let's go ahead and run this code now. And you can see it filled up this code, and as I select here, that method, that event gets fired and that method gets called. And so now if I want, I can update this to ABC, click update, and you can see it updates in my code here. If I want to add a new record, I say add it the current row, and it adds here. Now let's say I want to delete this record. So when I click delete, it's going to hit this and say, okay, I'm debugging now. Now when I hit F10 right here, watch what happens. Hit F10, accept the changes. Oh, sorry, I needed to hit F11. Delete this, come in here, hit F11. And so F10 stepped over what happened. So I actually had to press F11 in order to pop up in this event. And so you'll see, notice now, there was no current row selected. I know this is confusing, but let's F10 through this again. This actually gets called again because nothing is currently highlighted. Now there is a current row, but however we're deleting equals true, so don't do this code. Now watch, it actually then accepts changes. It actually fires this again for us because now 1 has been selected, and so now 1 has been selected, or sorry, at this point it hasn't. Now it's been selected, and now deleting is still true, so we're going to come back around. Deleting is still true. So you can see there's lots of times where it fires this. Now it's set to false, so now everything will be displayed just appropriately. So that's how confusing it can be when you delete this, and lots of other events can also be affected by that code. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at our next example here. So this next example, we're going to fill up our data grid here. Close down some other code here. Gotta get things cleaned up. Okay, so we've got this particular code, so we're still using a DataGrid view. And so what this is going to show you how to do is how we can bind data to our DataGrid view. And this one actually isn't even going to use a database. We're going to kind of skip that step. And so what you normally would do is you would select data from a database, pull it back into a data set. You would loop through your data set to fill up some sort of collection, like a list, and then you would bind that list to your DataGrid view. And so what I'm going to show you here is how we can use something what's called a binding list rather than the list class. And so a binding list, what it does is it actually gives you a two-way communication between your DataGrid view and this binding list for free. So what I mean by that is if you delete a row from your binding list, it will automatically communicate with the DataGrid view automatically. And so you delete it in your binding list, it will reflect that change in your DataGrid view. The same that if you change data in your DataGrid view, it will actually update your binding list automatically for you. So let's take a look at how we use this binding list. So here with our DataGrid view, I'm just setting up some columns automatically. So I'm going to manually fill up these columns where before they were auto-generated for us. And so you'll notice I've got these DataGrid view text box columns, and this last one I've actually done a button type column just to show you that there's different types of columns that we can create. And so now let's go down a little bit, and you can see that I'm just saying, note the property, data property name. And so what this is that this is the property that we're going to be binding to later on. So I'm just saying note this here. And so this is going to bind to a particular property in a class that we're going to show you in just a second. And so I've got this column, so let's take a look at column 1 now. So this is the property that we're going to bind to. So in this column, we're going to show the employee ID, and ID is the property in a class we're going to bind to. The next thing is what text should actually be displayed on our column, and what is the name of our column. Now down here, I'm just showing you can also do resizable and sort mode, and you can set these to different values. Now this fourth column is actually a button column. So here it's a little bit different where we're setting up our header text and everything like that. But inside this column, each one is just going to contain a button. And so there's this property called use column text for button value. And so what it means is this right here is what's going to be displayed on the button. Then we come down here to our DataGrid view and we just add all of our columns to our DataGrid view. So again, this is just, we've said to our DataGrid view, we don't want you to generate the columns automatically. We're going to go ahead and add in the columns to the DataGrid view. So now what we're going to do is I've got this employee class. Let me right click on this, go to definition. It's just down below. So inside of our employee class, you'll notice that it's a really simple class. It just contains 3 public properties: ID, first name, and last name. That's all it is. This whole class, its only job is just to hold data associated with an employee, the ID, the first name, and last name. So I'm going to click back here, takes us back. So we instantiate 3 new objects and just fill it up with random data. So what this could have done, so what you would have normally done here is said, okay, select all from my employee table, use my data access class, fill up a data set, loop through each row in my data set, and instantiate an employee object and fill up its data for every row in my data set. I've just sort of skipped that step. So this is where you'd connect to your database and pull back the data and fill up in-memory classes that represent the data in your database. Okay, so now that we've done that, we're going to come down here and you'll notice the first thing we're going to want to do is actually bind. So we've got our DataGrid view 1, and what we're going to do is we're going to say, oops, sorry, I've got this binding list, my binding list. Do we forget to instantiate that? Oh, sure did. Okay, so I forgot to actually instantiate the binding list. So this new class that we're going to take, so normally we've been working with the list class, right? So we could have a list, something like this, and this would be of type, what was it, CLS employee. What was the name of our class here? Employee. Now it doesn't know what a list is, so I actually have to add the system.using generics up here. So we've got list, and we could call this my list equals a new list. Then you could say my list.add, and we'd add those employees. So this is what we've done before. Now you can bind a list to a DataGrid view. However, if I were then to delete a row from my list here, it would not be reflected in my DataGrid view. So that's why we use a binding list, because we'll get this communication for free. So anytime you're going to be binding to a DataGrid view, you'll want to use what's called a binding list. So here we're going to say binding list, and you can see that it's exactly the same as a list. It's just called a binding list. And here we're going to say list of employees. We're going to instantiate that to a new binding list. So it's exactly the same as a list. It just has some extra plumbing in it where it'll take care of that communication back and forth between our DataGrid view. So now what we can do is we can now start adding some objects to our list. We can say .add, and we've got employee 1. And so what we can do now is we can just add those objects to our list here. So you can see that we can add employee 2 and employee 3. And so that's going to now add this to our binding list. So now that we've added it to our binding list, we can just say, hey, don't generate the columns automatically for us because we added them manually. And now we're going to bind to our list, we're going to bind this binding list to our DataGrid view and just bind it to its dating source. And then down here, what we're going to do is we're going to handle the cell click for our DataGrid view just like we've done before. And so now we're trying to pull out, hey, which one was actually selected by the user. And so what we can do now is we can actually just say, hey, let's figure out the DataGrid view.rows.e.row index. So in this cell click, we have an event args that we can pull out E and actually get the selected row index. So we're saying, okay, our DataGrid view, here's our selected row. there's this property called data bound item. So what's nice about this is now that we've used objects to bind to our DataGrid view, we can actually pull out the employee object that's bound to that row. So now we can pull out all of the information for a given employee. And so again, you always want to make sure that it's not null, because they can select like this bad row at the very bottom. And then what we can do is we can say, okay, if this column index equals the column index of our delete employee, so basically this is how we know if the user clicked the delete button or if they just clicked in one of the other cells. So if they did click the delete button, what we're going to do is we're going to say list of employees.remove the particular employee that we have selected. And this is another way that we could have done it. So we can either delete from the list, which is a binding list, so this will reflect in our DataGrid view, or we can go to our DataGrid view.rows and remove that particular row, which will also remove it from our binding list. And then if just an individual row is selected, we then just go ahead and display that data. So let's go ahead and run this now. And you can see that it filled up the data, and as I start selecting these various objects, it fills up their data down below, and then when I click one of these, it's going to actually update that data in our list because we've bound it to a binding list. So again, whether I do it this way or I do it this way, it's going to update that particular data. So this last example now, this is just dealing with our airline reservation assignment, and so I just wanted to go over this DB and add objects combo box example, and this helps you with how you can select passengers and do some of the requirements for your next assignment, which is your airline reservation system. So there's two ways you can run this application. So the first one is you run it and you do step one, close down the application, run it again, and then you do step two. So let's do step one. When you select a passenger from the combo box, their seat will turn green. So you can see I've actually put a bunch of objects into this combo box. Let's say if I select Sean, you can see my seat turns green. Let's run this again. The second way that you can run this is the red seat is taken, so if you don't click on it, you will select that passenger. So notice how I click blue seats and nothing happens because there's no passengers assigned to those seats, but if I click the red seat, not only does that passenger get selected in my combo box, but their seat turns green. So you can see this is going to help you with some requirements for your airline reservation system. So let's take a look at how this code was implemented. So we have our data access class here, which we've just added in. We've set this to our reservation system. We have a passengers class, which again, you'd want to use private variables and public properties, but I've just done this for an example. So I've just got these, we'll pretend these are public properties for ID, first name, last name, the seat, and flight number. So this is all the information associated with a passenger. However, we're going to pull out data from the database, fill up passenger objects, and bind those to our combo box. But all we want displayed in our combo box to the end user is first name and last name, so we override the toString the toString method. Now in our form, what we're going to do is we're going to instantiate our data access class. We're going to then create an SQL statement that is going to pull all of the passengers that just happen to be on flight 1 in our database. So it just pulls back all that passenger's information, as we can see on this first line here. We're going to execute that SQL statement, so that says, hey, give me all of the passengers on flight 1, and that gives them all of their information in this data set. Now I'm going to loop through that data set, and so for every row I'm going to instantiate a new passenger, fill up that passenger's information in my local object, and then I'm going to add that object to my combo box. So now my combo box is filled up with passenger objects. Now the thing to remember again is that you would never want to do this code behind your user interface. I've done this for an example. Okay, you'd get docked on your assignment if you did it this way. You would want all of this logic inside a separate business layer class. So here is behind the UI. You would never do this logic. What you would create is all of this logic in a separate class that probably returns a list that you can then bind to this combo box. But as far as this method is concerned, all you do is use this other class, say give me all passengers, returns you a list, and then you would bind it to this passenger or this combo box. So here is where we actually click on a seat. So one of the requirements is you will only click on taken seats. So if it's not red, don't do anything. You can see I just skip over the code here. So if it is a taken seat, which I can tell by the back color equaling red, I just turn that seat color to green, because on my seat click, you can see I'm pulling in the label that was clicked via the sender object. Now I can just say, okay, I know the seat is by the text property of whatever label was clicked. So now I'm going to loop through all of the passengers in my combo box. And so for each row in my combo box, I'm going to pull out the current passenger. Then I'm going to check to see if that passenger seat equals the seat on the label that was clicked. If it is, I change the combo box's index to the selected passenger. Then the last thing here is the selected index change of our combo box. I can then say, okay, pull out the selected item, cast it to a passenger. So now I have all the passengers' information that I need that was selected. I can pull out their seat and put it to the label. Then here I can actually say, okay, loop through all of the controls inside this panel, which you can see all of my controls are contained within this collection called a panel. And I can say, okay, loop through all the labels. I'm automatically just going to turn every label to blue, and then I'm only going to select the passenger seat that was selected. So I'm going to say, okay, look at the seat number on that label. Does it match the passenger that was selected seat? If it did, change their seat to green. So hopefully this allows you, helps you with your airline reservation assignment.